Hello again, children. And this to now will be the 13th of my own wonderful Horror Nights history videos for the event of Halloween Horror Nights 19 ripped from the silver screen. Yes. And in my previous videos, all 12 of them, I covered the first 6 houses of the event, all of which were the IP, intellectual property houses based on actual movies, or at least the franchises or the movie concepts themselves. But there were a couple of original houses as well, which we finally have gotten to. The original houses, 2 of them. But although these were original houses, not really directly adapted from any previous film, there was a brand involved nevertheless. A brand? Yes. So, to talk about this, I have to take you back to a magical world. Mysterious and long forgotten. Well, not really, but it almost seems that way nowadays. It was called the 20th century. A strange world where people didn't actually have computers in their houses, except for the nerdiest, geekiest geeks. Yes, but most people didn't have computers in their houses. In fact, a large part of the 20th century, a computer today, of course. And hello, this little object is a computer. You may not realize it, but it really is. It's sort of like Mother Box back in the Forever People. If you're of a certain age, you might remember the Forever People. But if you're kids nowadays, you have no idea. And so this mysterious land called the 20th century is probably something you read about in ancient history, or rather you see it on your mobile devices in ancient videos and ancient texts that you might come up on when you bring up your devices there, your pads and your smartphones. Back in those days, phones weren't smart. And most of them were actually chained to the wall by this strange piggy-tail curly thing. And if you had a mobile phone, it was like this big, with a huge antenna hanging off of it. And then you walk around with one hanging on your belt and you look like a douche. And most people who walked around with mobile phones back in those days were douches. To be honest. And everyone hated them. And the nerds who had their computers who were playing silly games which had no graphics or animation, just little bits of text, You go into a dangerous forest and then tap, 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 tap. You see a sword, tap, tap, tap. Pick it up, yes, no, and then you do that. A dragon comes out and kills you. Fuck. Okay, I don't pick up the sword. The dragon comes out and kills you. What the hell do I do? Every time I type in, the dragon kills me. What the fuck is it? That's what happens. Little bits of text on a screen. Most of them impossibly hard to play. Fucking bullshit. But people played them. Trust me. Did I play these? Do I look like a big fat nerd? Oh. Okay, never mind. So, back in those days, but I need to take you further back. Back long before there ever was an internet. I know the little kids out there are saying, how could there ever be a time when there was no internet? Oh my God, where did people get their porn? Anyway, little kids said that? Trust me. Go back further. Hey, when you're my age, anyone under 30 looks like a little kid, all right? In fact, the 30-year-olds are starting to look like teenagers already. So I'm going back through time, 100 years ago, when a child was born. But let's go up a little bit further to when he was about 13. So here we go. Not quite 100 years ago, but close. the early part of the 20th century, a group of adolescent boys, primarily, a lot of them Jewish for some reason, but they were, yes, what we would call today geeks or nerds. But didn't call them that back then because they didn't even know what that was. They were just, you know, nervous, slender, studious, bespectacled boys who didn't want to go out and play at sports, but rather stay home and read things about spaceships or something. What the hell was wrong with them? Yes. And they began to communicate with each other through the only social network that was available at that time. It was made out of paper. Yes, paper was very important back then. The closest thing to an internet was paper. There were these sort of, if you wanted to have a blog, you had to start a fanzine. That's a little later, though. And your social network was basically the letter columns in the science fiction or horror magazines. But in order to get, but this is what we're talking about, actually. We're talking about how that happened. So back in these days, a handful of these boys discovered they could communicate with each other. They could find other people like themselves. And they started this very first social network, writing letters in a column of a magazine they liked. It was called The Comet. The very first science fiction magazine ever. The Comet. It was edited and published by a fellow named Hugo Gernsback. And that's why, to this day, the main award in science fiction is called the Hugo. There's a little fact for you. But you see, these handful of boys, including one chap named Mort Weisinger, who later went down to be one of the founders of DC Comics, I believe, and helped to establish the whole heroes that we all know today. Another one, Julius Schwartz, similar thing. But there was, and like I said, most of these guys were Jewish boys about 13 years old. But there was one in particular, a very important boy, who really was, I believe, one of the founding fathers, if not the founding father of what we today call fandom. Yes, this is the godfather of geeks, the founding father of fandom. The fact that that's illiterate, he would have loved that. His name was Forrest James Ackerman. Forrest J Ackerman. And he coined the term sci-fi, in fact. He has a rather huge impact on the whole concept of fandom. And it's important because he became rather famous in his time. Not for being an actor, not for being a director, not for being a writer, but for being a fan. He was the first person who achieved celebrity through fandom. And even was given an award, the #1 science fiction fan in the world, by these science fiction organizations when they first started having them, and the only person at that time to ever receive such an award, and perhaps even to this day. It was quite amazing how this happened. But he didn't just geek out over things, although he did. And people like Harry Knowles or others who became famous for similar reasons, they're like the true sons of Forrest Ackerman, who I don't think ever had any sons of his own. He's been dead for a few years. He was a closet case. But I'm not going to... how do I know that? We have ways of knowing about each other, trust me. And yeah, he was also I think dabbled in the dark arts. I think he was involved with Anton LaVey for a little while, but that's another little bit of talking behind tones, and I don't want to, but you can't really, well, I said he's been dead for a few years. I would never have said that when the man was still living. People deserve to have their secrets, but if I know about it, it wasn't that big of a secret. You know where to look. Oh, alrighty then. But getting back to Forrest J. Ackerman, he was actually a very nice man, extremely polite, and would encourage any young person to follow their dreams. And amongst the people who he encouraged at very young ages included many of the people who today have become household words. For example, a young lad named Stephen King, who wrote a letter to the magazine that Ackerman founded many years ago. You see, what Ackerman did, the one big creative act for someone who mainly was just a fan, was to found one of the first, if not the first, horror magazines. They had science fiction before. There were things like Weird Tales, but this was for horror movies. This was going beyond just collections of creepy stories. This was a magazine that featured the classic Universal monsters primarily, originally, but then the Hammer films and many other remarkable, eventually going on to science fiction films, Star Wars, etc., in the 70s. But for decades, this magazine, now I think they've revived it a couple of times. They might even still be publishing a version of it today, although, of course, it no longer had anything to do with Forrest Ackerman, and he's been dead now for a couple of years. But it's called Famous Monsters of Filmland. And especially when it first started, you could expect to see images of the great Universal classic monsters painted lovingly by a man named Boris on the cover of this magazine month after month. And it was a very important magazine for a generation of monster horror geeks and nerds, most of whom are even older than I am. But it's encouraged many, many people to go into this sort of thing. And another generation later, of course, there were other magazines that were inspired by the success of Forrest Ackerman with this very seminal horror magazine. There was one called Castle of Frankenstein, for example. Marvel tried to imitate Famous Monsters for a little bit in the 70s. It was called Monsters of the Movies. That failed. But there was one magazine that popped up in the mid-1970s, the mid to late 70s, which was the first one to really become successful after Famous Monsters. Successful in a new, startling, and brilliant way because they went beyond that. They were, first of all, mainly in color. Well, they started out, they had some pulp and black and white with some slick pages. But as time went on, they became a slick, a full slick magazine, all in color. And they didn't shy away from images of extreme gore. But one of the very first issues showed the head being exploding, an exploding head from a film called Scanners. And another issue showed some of the extreme violence in the film Dawn of the Dead. And at the time, that was shocking and new. You didn't actually see knives going into heads and the sort of violent imagery in full color in the magazine. There were certain things they just wouldn't publish. And they went beyond that. And it was like, oh my God, this is awesome. I've never seen that in a magazine before. I bought the first issue, had Godzilla on the cover. I wish I still had it. But that was back when I was about 16 years old, I think, maybe. Yes, exactly right. 1979, I believe it was. So, it was called Fangoria. Fangoria. It was originally supposed to be called Fantastica, but that's a little bit of trivia that you probably don't really need to know about. Fangoria. And it built a base and started becoming more and more the horror magazine. It quickly outstripped its older cousin, Famous Monsters of Filmland, because Fangoria was young and brash and rock and roll and more than a little bit punk. It was heavy metal. It was motorcycles. It was professional wrestling. It was balls to the walls. It didn't have that effete politeness that Forrest always put in with the silly puns and all of that and Famous Monsters. Not that that was not something that was absolutely adorable to stay, but Fangoria went out. Fangoria was like, Eddie, as opposed to, not to Jack, but to, I don't know, the Caretaker, maybe. I mean, that's how big it was, difference between these two magazines. And Fangoria became a loud, brash, success and started becoming more and more popular. From the sporadic publication in the early years, where sometimes you couldn't find an issue even when you were looking for it, to something that became a household word in the horror community, which started growing even more from that time. There was a thing called splatterpunk, and it was born out of Fangoria. Really, I think it had a lot to do with it. Eventually, the magazine started to fail, and you can blame the internet for that. I think they've resurrected it and got it going again. I've kind of stopped reading magazines a few years ago because it just too much. I had too much. I only have so much space in the house, and I can't keep bazillion back issues locked away. Becoming places where roaches and ants and rats will ultimately nest, because no matter how many plastic bags you stick things in, ultimately it all goes back to dust. That's just a tragic fact. The Buddhists tell us that everything is impermanent, and paper products especially. I think one of the great things about this electronic age is if we get to a point where all of our magazines and everything are online, then we'll save forests. Imagine how many trees have been chopped down every year for newspapers and magazines, and if we have other ways of getting our information, that might be a much better way of doing it. Although I wonder about, the efficiency of the electronic medium and what has to be burned in order for it to have the power to process it. Ultimately, is the footprint greater or smaller? But I think the actual number of trees that are cut down in order to make all the paper products, and the processing and the plants, and to make the paper and the printing and all of that, perhaps I think the electronic media is probably better environmentally, even though there's a cost to both. There's always a price, for everything. Anyway, that's my little environmental query, but never mind. So Fangoria was already about shaky, and at that particular point in 2009, it was on the verge of collapse. But somehow, before that happened, there was somehow a contractual deal to use the brand name to sell the two original houses. And so both of these houses originally had the label Fangoria Presents. And that actually appeared on the website. When you were in the Universal Palace Theatre and you look at different posters which represent, as movie posters, represent the haunted houses and the scare zones, the Fangoria Presents was there, above the titles of these two original houses. Leave It to Cleaver and The Spawning. Their titles actually being Fangoria Presents Leave It to Cleaver, Fangoria Presents The Spawning. So, but I'm pretty darn sure, in fact I don't have to be sure, it is actually here, amazingly enough. I hadn't realized that, but it was actually on the brochure too, but no one ever seems to remember that. Look, here's proof. Leave It to Cleaver, Fangoria Presents. And then down here, The Spawning, Fangoria Presents. See? It's there. It's there. So it's on the brochures, it's on the website, but most people don't even notice it. It's not really in the signage for the houses. When you go in the house, you don't see a big Fangoria sign. It got downplayed during the event itself. Downplayed. And part of that was because Fangoria was getting really shaky at that time. It had this hot competitor called Rue Morgue in Canada. And they really, really did their magazine better than Fangoria, I have to admit it. They did a much better job with the writing and with some of the photography and some of the more extreme things they came up with. It was really brilliant. There was also a thing called Cinefantastique that was around for a while. That was just too intellectual for most of the normal fans who... And Rue Morgue was a bit intellectual too, but it was still more amazing compared to Fango, and and it was part of what hurt it. But I think what really killed Fangoria at that time was the internet, and of course ultimately it's what saves it, because that's what happens to magazines. As the paper disappears, they become something you read on your phone, you see. I'm not sure if it's still around. Like I said, I haven't paid attention. And of course there are other websites that were never magazines that show up, like Bloody Disgusting, which might even be able to do what Fangoria did for people back in the old days, which is part of what I was getting at. I think it's been revived, but for a while there it was on the verge of collapse. It was right about this time, October 2009, when it was really on the verge of collapse. And that might be why they didn't follow through then, and they didn't highly promote it during the event. But for years it had been Fangoria presence had been at Horror Nights. They used to have a radio show, if you recall, in the 90s and early part of the 21st century, but that had ended before this. So those were the two original houses. Now, of course, I've already finished the video and I haven't got to the houses themselves. There you go. So next video, number 14, I shall start in describing the first of these two houses. Leave it to Cleaver.